Is this not the fast which I choose, to loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke? Is it not to divide your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into the house? When you see the naked, to cover him and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. Then your light will break out like the dawn, and your recovery will speedily spring forth, and your righteousness will go before you. The glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry, and he will say, here I am. If you remove the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness, and if you give yourself to the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then your light will rise in darkness, and your gloom will become like midday. So Isaiah speaks these words in God's name in chapter 58. This is a passage that we read in the morning as the Haftarah in the Yom Kippur morning service. And the passage challenges us, and it's very striking, of course, when we read it on Yom Kippur, to consider, the practices that we do in fasting. And of course, Yom Kippur, the practices that we've been doing for the month before, leading up to Rosh Hashanah and then to Yom Kippur. And Isaiah has God say that actually that's not really what God wants. What God wants is that we share our bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into the house. So that's quite a challenge, because I don't know how to do that. I know how to bring a can to the can drive in the synagogue or in the school, but I don't really know how to divide my bread with the hungry so that the hungry person is no longer hungry. And that's really what this series is meant to help us figure out. I'll be giving a sort of introductory shiur tonight. It's really the next 2 weeks, as well as the workshops, which many of you attended tonight, that are going to help us take this so much further. And I want to, you all have in front of you, there's flyers, new flyers. If you could each grab a copy, I hope there's enough to go around. I want to very briefly mention what's coming up the next 2 weeks. And I'd like to ask each of you to walk out today with at least one flyer and to put it someplace where other people will see it, in your shul, in your pizza place or hamburger joint. If you are in churches, in your church, leave it someplace where people will see it, because the next 2 weeks we have incredible speakers who will teach us a lot and also give us some instruction as to how we can try to fulfill Isaiah's challenge. So let me take you through it very quickly. Next week, our 2 workshops continue, and I want to thank Karen Fleisch, who has a new baby, and she needed to go home with him, and of course, David Silber. And after that, we have a lecture by Mark Winnie. Mark Winnie is coming to us from, was it New Mexico? So he's coming from us. He's an expert on food systems, on everything from the experience of the hungry individual to national and state level policy. And he'll be talking about kind of the big picture as well as the kind of microcosmic view of what's actually going on with hunger in America, what's working, what's not working. He'll also be bringing copies of one or both of his books and selling those for people who are interested. I've read his first book and really totally transformed the way I look at the issue of hunger. So I can't recommend Mark more highly. And then the following week, on the 25th, we have 2 really amazing things at 6 o'clock, and it's at 6, not 6:30. Instead of the workshops, we have a film called The Place at the Table. I showed this after I watched it myself. I watched it the second time with my husband at home, and my 14-year-old daughter watched it as well. And it too is really a transformative event to see this film and to really understand quite differently what's going on the level of human experience and on the level, again, of policy. Very challenging film and extremely well done. So I really recommend that for those who can make it here at 6, or if you want to come late, that's fine too. And then at 7:45, we have a couple of really, really special people. Lisanne Finson happens to be a colleague of mine. She ran a program for 20 years in New Jersey, which really started as a soup kitchen and became really an institution that brought people up from poverty and homelessness and helped really make people self-sufficient. And she'll be coming along with Pam Johnson, who at one point was a person who was homeless and hungry and was a client of the soup kitchen, and over the course of time actually undertook a journey and is now the head chef of the kitchen. So they will be talking together, not just about the project that they ran, but really trying to help us in this last session of our series, help us think about very practically what we can actually do. So spread the word. Again, please take a flyer with you and leave it someplace, and I hope you can join us for the coming 2 weeks. We, in thinking about how to craft this series on hunger, had to make a decision, whether we're talking about world hunger, whether we're talking about hunger in Israel, whether we're talking about domestic hunger, hunger in the Jewish community, hunger in the general community. We couldn't do it all, and we felt we needed to focus, so we did decide to focus on domestic hunger. I want to acknowledge, of course, that there are hungry people around the world, and I want to specifically mention an organization that's dear to our hearts, which is Leket. We had, I think, Elena's here. Stand up, Elena. Elena's here from Leket. How many people know about Leket? You may get a Leket Purim card. There's Leket materials outside on the literature table, as well as materials from several other organizations. Take those materials and learn what organizations, what kind of work they're doing and how you might be able to get involved. So we're really appreciative that our partners who are doing such good work in Israel are with us tonight. One more thing before I begin the shiur tonight is just a real huge thanks to the Drisha staff. I feel like each of these Dirshu series is so different from the one before. It's almost like starting something new every time. How we publicize it, how we frame it, who we reach out to, and the Drisha staff does a tremendous amount of work getting the word out and doing all the things, down to cutting the vegetables that you are all enjoying. So thank you very much to the Drisha staff for that. So the author of Mesilat Yesharim starts his book in a way that probably nobody should ever start a book or a shiur, but I'm actually going to start it the same way. He says, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know. But I'm going to try to say it in a way that hits home. So that's what I'm going to try. Now, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know. If you walk out of here and somebody says, what did she say? You're going to be able to sum it up in a sentence, and the person's going to say, yeah, what's new about that? I think, though, that, first of all, the sources that I'm going to learn with you are incredibly interesting. Ariella, I left my stack of sources in my office. Can you go with them? Yeah. Sorry. You said I would do that, probably, and I did. So the sources are really beautiful and incredibly interesting sources. But also, I see tonight's session, if I do it well, and if you give yourselves along with me in this shiur, as kind of inviting us all to an exercise of religious imagination. This shiur is going to be about rain and how rain is understood in biblical texts and in rabbinic texts. And I want to offer you the understanding of rain that we're going to be encountering as a kind of a model or a framework to carry with you, hopefully through the next couple of weeks and throughout the work that we will all go on to do in thinking about how we attempt to fulfill our responsibilities in relation to issues such as hunger. So thank you, perfect timing. A little drama, it's always good to have it. Okay, I'll wait till they start to go around. I got one. I'm good, yeah. Otherwise I would have realized earlier that okay. Thanks, Ed. So it's stapled as if it's a Hebrew handout. So the top source should say Bereshit Rabbah. Yeah, that's your first page. Okay. So Bereshit Rabbah, midrashic text. We're gonna first read just the first 2 lines of the source, and then later, a little later this evening, we're gonna get to the rest of this source. So just the first 2 lines of it. I'll read the Hebrew and I'll kind of ad-lib my own translation. The source says, "Kach hayta haaretz shota mitchila, ve'ed yaleh min haaretz v'hishka et kol eitz hagan." V'hishka et kol pnei ha'adama. V'chazar bo HaKadosh Baruch Hu shelo tehei ha'aretz shotah ela milmala. Originally, the Midrash says, the earth drank in the following way. And as the earth got water in the following way, quoting Genesis chapter 2, an aid, which I'll translate here as a spring would go up from the earth and water all of the surface of the ground. And so originally, the earth was watered by means of a spring. Bless you. And the Blessed Holy One changed his mind so that the earth would only drink from above. Now, what is this referring to? What it's referring to is the passage that you have next on your page, Genesis chapter 2. This is the introduction to the second account of creation. And the text tells us in verse 5, V'chol siach hasadeh terem yeh ba'aretz, v'chol esef hasadeh terem yitzmach, ki lo himtir Hashem Elokim al ha'aretz, v'adam ayin la'avod et ha'adamah. There was no shrub of the field yet on the land, and there was no grass of the field yet growing, because the Lord God had not called on the land, and there was no human being to work the earth. So there's two reasons that there's no plant life yet. One is lack of rain, and the other is that there's no human being to till the soil. Now, if we skip to verse 7, we see that it says, "Vayitzar Hashem Elokim et Adam afar min ha'adamah." God shaped the human being from the dust of the earth. God breathed in his nostrils the breath of life, and the human being became a living creature. So that corresponds to one of the lacks in verse 5, right? There's no human being. Now, what about there's no rain? Right? God hadn't caused rain, and there's no human being. Verse 7 says God makes a human being. So what would you expect verse 6 to say? God brings rain. So what does verse 6 say? Verse 6 says, "Ve'ed ya'aleh min ha'aretz v'hishka et kol panei ha'adamah." An aid would go up from the land and watered all the surface of the ground. Now, nobody actually knows what the word aid means, because it only appears one other time in the entire Tanakh, and that's in the book of Job, and nobody has a clue what it means there either. And if anybody knows modern Hebrew, right, adim, right, is mist or water that evaporates. But that modern Hebrew meaning of the word comes from one of really two possible understandings of what aid means in verse 6. If you look at the English translation that I have here, which is the New American Standard Bible, it's just what I got on the internet, it translates, "A mist used to rise from the earth." And that is a very common translation. An alternative translation, which I think is a much better translation, is that it's not talking about a mist that would rise from the earth. And what's the idea of the mist rising from the earth? Is the idea that verse 6 should correspond to the fact that verse 5 told us there was no rain yet. So then verse 6 is telling us, okay, God brought rain. How? The old water cycle, right? The water evaporates up from the earth, and then it comes down, precipitates and comes down as rain. So that's that understanding of aid. But actually, I think a much better understanding of aid is the one that I put in brackets, which is that it's talking about some kind of an upswelling of subterranean water, some sort of a spring or something like that. In other words, that verses 5 and 6 are saying God didn't yet cause rain to come. Rather, instead, there was a different way that God watered the earth in those days, right? God watered the earth through an upswelling of subterranean waters. And rain will only come later on. Now, we could talk a lot more about that, but we won't. Let me just posit that that is, of course, the understanding. It's the second understanding that the Midrash in Drisha Rabbah is using. The Midrash is understanding as that initially, the way the earth got its water, the way the earth drank, shotah, was from this spring, which would come up from the ground. But God changed God's mind, and God determined that from now on, the way the earth would get water would be from above. And the Midrash will go on to say, we'll get back to this later, we'll tend to answer the question, why does rain come from above? Hence the title of this session. But before we get to the Midrash's explanation of why God would change God's mind and determine that it's a better policy to have the ground watered by rain, I want to look at the next text, which is Deuteronomy chapter 11, because this text actually contrasts two different locales the land of Egypt on the one hand and the land of Canaan, the land of Israel on the other hand. And it contrasts those two lands in terms of how each of those lands gets its water. You'll notice I bolded 3 verses, and then the 4th verse, which is not bolded, begins the passage that we know of as V'haya im Shema, as the second passage of Shema. So we'll keep that in mind. We'll get back to that later, but just to contextualize a little bit. So Devarim chapter 11 says the following thing. Ki ha'aretz asher ata ba shama l'rishta, lo ke'eretz Mitzrayim hu asher yitzatem misham, asher tizrat zaracha v'hishkita b'raglecha kigan hayarak. The land which you are coming to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, which, meaning the land of Egypt, you sow your seed and you water it with your foot like a vegetable garden. Just a caveat, what does it mean water with your foot? So there's different hypotheses about it, but the...
something which allowed the water to irrigate.
Right, so what most people say about this, not 100% clear, but what most people say about this is that the land of Egypt was, of course, essentially watered by the Nile and the tributaries of the Nile, and then irrigation channels, which would be directed to different parts of your field, and that when you wanted to direct water to one or another part of your field, you would do that by opening an opening in a channel or by closing it with your foot. So that's one hypothesis, but it certainly is referring to the fact that Egypt gets its water from the Nile, from the river. But on the other hand, verse 11, but the land which you are crossing over to possess is different. Eretz harim uvkaot. It's a land of hills and valleys. Limtar hashamayim tishtemayim. It, the land, or possibly you, could be either one, but I'll translate right now as it, the land will drink water from the rain of the heavens. Verse 12, Eretz asher Hashem Elokecha doresh ota. Tamid einei Hashem Elokecha ba mereshit hashana v'ad acharit hashana. It is a land which the Lord your God is doresh. We'll get back to that word in a minute. A land which the Lord your God is doresh. Always the eyes of the Lord your God are upon it from the beginning of the year through the end of the year. So what is the distinction that's being made here? The Egypt, on the one hand, right, gets its water from the Nile and it's irrigated by you. But on the other hand, the land which you're coming to, it is a land of hills and valleys, mountains and valleys. God is doresh it. God is always looking upon it, and it gets watered by rain. What is the distinction that the passage is drawing? What's the significance, according to this passage, of the difference between being irrigated from a river or getting irrigated or getting water from the heavens? Yeah.
Well, this thought is not original with me, but the water from the ground, it seems, unless it's a really, really dry year, that it's always there. Mm-hmm. You don't have to ask God for it. It's just there. Whereas with the rain, you have much more a sense of being dependent on God for it to rain.
Okay, great. So rain, right? Rain might come, or it might not come, which is, of course, the theme of the V'haya im Shema, right? The passage that continues, right? If you do what I say, right, then there will be rain. But verse 17, right? If you don't, verse 17, God will be angry with you. Ve'atzar et hashamayim. God will close up the heavens. V'lo yamatar. There will not be rain. So you're dependent on God, and also, for one reason or another, which the passage goes on to explain, it may not come or it may come.
Right.
Okay. What else? Yeah.
I don't know if this is where you want to go, but it occurs to me that the land of Egypt, of Mitzrayim, is a flat country. The Torah goes out of its way to contrast the land of Canaan that you're going to be going to has mountains and valleys.
Okay.
In other words, different levels.
Yeah.
Egypt gets its water from its own level. It's at the same flat level.
Okay.
As a source of water.
Okay.
But the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, is not. It has peaks and valleys.
Okay.
And perhaps, therefore, the water also is necessary to come from different levels. It
Okay.
can't come- It's at so many different levels, so it can't, Egypt is flat, so the water
Right.
comes to the same level.
Right. So if anybody here ever learned the beginning of Moed Katan?
I just started to do that.
Amazing.
I signed up with it.
Okay.
And I wanted to tell it, but it was taken, so I had to take one cut.
So here's the problem: when you start Moed Katan, right? You for those who don't know what I'm talking about, that's fine because most people have no clue what the story meant. It talks about Beit HaBaal and Beit HaShlachim, and we urbanites, right, have no clue what that's talking about. Beit HaBaal and Beit HaShlachim. You have to read some commentary, and you still don't really know, right? Till you actually go someplace in Israel where they show you kind of primitive agriculture, and all of a sudden it makes sense. Beit HaBaal, Baal was Baal.
What is it?
Yeah, right. It's when the Baal was the god of what? But what was Baal the god of? It's a storm god, right? So Beit HaBaal, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny that we're using our Avodah Zarah term, right? But Beit HaBaal, right, is land which is dependent on rain, whereas Beit HaShlachim is land which you can irrigate. Beit HaBaal will always not. Something that's elevated will always be a Beit HaBaal. You can't irrigate up the mountain. Okay, so
I
yeah,
understood the significance of the mountains.
Yeah.
That sometimes the clouds could go beyond and then bring somewhere else instead of here.
interesting. Okay, that may be true. Right, that may be true. That when you have hills and valleys, sometimes it may get to you and sometimes not. But the point also is that if you have mountains, you can't actually just rely on irrigation. You need the rain to come down. Okay, what else are we seeing here? Yeah.
I mean, in a more metaphorical way, like
Yeah.
Egypt could represent kind of underground, like this kind of profane, sinning world, like the waters on the ground, the earth. And whereas going into the promised land, it's more like spiritual, heavenly, and so we are nourished from above.
Okay, so that's just limtar hashamayim, right? That what nourishes us is coming from elsewhere, right? It's not what's already here, right? It's coming from elsewhere. It's coming from something that we, associate with the divine, right? It's not our realm; it's the realm of the divine. Okay, what else? Yeah. Oh, sorry. There's either of you. Don't fight. You can both go ahead. Yeah.
I think we're supposed to think of Egypt as the less desirable of the two. Egypt is that bad place where we were, and God's taking us out of there to a better place. But it's a little counterintuitive because Egypt has this natural, constant source of water, and in Israel it seems like it's not so clear that it's always going to be there, and it's a little, the topography is a little different, and so there's sort of an irony in the contrast. And usually when they talk about
How true.
Eretz Yisrael, right, it's the place that you left, and you don't ever want to go back there, and you basically
Right, but of course, as we know both from Sefer Bereshit and from ancient history, right? Egypt is the breadbasket of the ancient world, and in Sefer Bereshit, where do they always go when there's a famine? Right, they go to Egypt because the fact of the matter is the contrast is not between an easy place to live and a hard place to live. Actually, it is between an easy place to live and a hard place to live. The easy place to live is the land of Egypt. The hard place to live is the land of Israel. And the reason it's a hard place to live is what? Right? Why is it a harder place to live? Because the water is iffy and... Exactly, right. It's because the water is iffy, right? And within the theology of the text, the water is iffy because, verse 12, Eretz Asher Hashem Elokecha Doresh Ota. Right? It's a land which God is checking into. How do you understand Doresh here, by the way? Like if you had to translate it.
Seeking prayer.
Sorry?
Seeking prayer.
Okay, seeking prayer. What else? How else could you translate Doresh? Sorry?
Doresh means
To demand. Okay, how else could you translate Doresh? To search. Okay, one second. I just want, what else? Doresh, Drisha, Dirshu, yeah. Okay, how else? In this context, if you had to you're translating, you're not gonna, right? You're doing the New American Upper West Side Bible translation. You have to, just translate. Verse 12, a land which. So this is interesting. Look at the translation that I have here, which again is totally random. It happens to be the New American Standard Bible because that's what I found on the internet first. Translates here, a land for which the Lord your God cares. Now that's really interesting because I think Doresh here does have this whole set of nuances. And on the one hand, there's care, right? God's checking into it because God cares about it. And on the other hand, right, the flip side of caring, as every parent has tried to convince their recalcitrant teenager, the flip side of caring is, no, you can't stay out till 2 in the morning. Oh, the other kids allow them to? Well, I don't care about the other kids. I care about you, right? So Doreshota really has both those things. This is a land that God cares about, which means, yes, that God nourishes it by giving God's life-giving waters, and at the same time, it means that God is Doresh in the sense of the juridical sense that we know from elsewhere in Sefer Devarim, Drisha v'chakira v'darashta v'chakata hetev. You investigate it, right? There's a kind of forensic sense. God is inquiring. God is checking into things. Did you come home on time? If not, you're grounded for a week, right? God is checking it out. And again, that leads into the V'hayim Shemo passage that continues. God's checking it out. And if God doesn't like what God sees, right, God's eyes are on it all the time. Is this the elf on the shelf? Is this place too Jewish to know about? You guys don't know about the elf on the shelf?
No, tell. Never heard of it. Sounds great.
Nobody here knows about the elf on the shelf?
No.
There was also Reddy on the.
Tell us about the elf on the shelf.
I don't know if I know too much about it. It's like a little elf that's on the shelf creates the games. And I think it's like doesn't watch over to make sure that you're doing well.
Yeah, it's this really, I don't know who, any child psychologists in the room? I don't know who invented this idea, but it's for like kids who celebrate Christmas, and like the month or so before Christmas, a parent, and this elf is essentially like watching what you do to tell Santa whether you've been good. And I think like it's electrical and it looks around us. I mean, it's an incredibly creepy idea. But that's right. And now, God's always watching, right? So it's not about which is the easier place to live. That's hands down. The easier place to live is Egypt, right? Because the land of Canaan might not get rain. And at the end of the day, it actually depends on you. Now, by the way, this distinction between, this idea of Egypt being kind of a nice place to live comes up not only in the fact that our patriarchs keep going down to Egypt when there's a famine, but in Genesis 13, right when Abraham has come back from the land of Mitzrayim, and he and Lot are separating, and then Lot is told to choose where he wants to go, and Lot decides, this is chapter 13, verse 10, for those who have a Chumash or whatever, Lot lifts up his eyes and he sees the Jordan Valley, that it is mashkeh, it's all watered, right? Why is the Jordan Valley mashkeh? Why is it? Because it's got, right, for the same reason that Egypt is, right? Because it's right by the river, right? And it says, and this was before God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, which the next verse tells us is a very, very, very bad place indeed. Actually, verse 13 tells us that. So the verse anticipates that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because the people are ra'im v'chata'im l'Hashem ma'od. They're very, very evil and they're sinful. So he lifts up his eyes and he sees this incredibly fertile place. And then it says, Ki gam Hashem ke'eretz Mitzrayim. It's like the garden of the Lord, which of course brings us back to Eden, right? The place where there was an aid, not rain, right? Ke'eretz Mitzrayim, just like the land of Egypt. So the land of Egypt is being compared to the area of Sodom, where people can be as bad as they want, and it's still going to be nice and green. But that's not true of the land of Canaan. So just summing up, and we'll get back to this passage in Devarim chapter 11 a little later, but just summing up, the contrast that we started with, that Bereshit Rabbah points to, and that already appears in Genesis chapter 2, is the contrast between living in a world in which the water is assured, in which it's always there, and living in a world in which it might come, it might not come, a world in which when it comes from the heavens, and a world in which the very coming or not coming of rain signifies that God is looking down on you, looking down in care, and at the same time looking down in demands. That's the contrast that's being offered here in the book of Devarim. So I want to move from that, again, we'll get back to that a bit later on, but I want to move from that to looking at a couple of rabbinic texts about what actually makes the rain not come. Because an interesting thing happens here. In Devarim chapter 11, what makes the rain not come? Right? We say this twice a day, right? Right? What makes the rain not come? Right. So give us a chapter and verse here, chapter 11, verse 16, right? Hishamru lachem Right? Watch out, beware, right? That you're reading from the English here, your hearts are not deceived, that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them, or God's going to be angry at you and God will shut up the heavens and there will not be rain. Okay, so the not listening, right? Right? If you listen to my mitzvot, then verse 14, I will give rain. But if you do something else, I will shut up the heavens. And thus something else that is pointed to here specifically, we might imagine it's all mitzvot, and probably the implication is that it is, but the thing that is highlighted here is idol worship, avodah zarah, idolatry. Now I want to look very briefly at two texts, one from the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael and one from the Babylonian Talmud, that gives a slightly different account of what it might be that the rains are ne'etzarim, or stopped up. Again, using that word, v'atzar et hashamayim, stop up the heavens. Okay, so on the bottom of the same page, you have a passage from the Talmud Yerushalmi, the 3rd chapter of Tractate Ta'anit, which is a great chapter, mostly about rain and what happens with the lack of rain. And the passage says the following thing. It says, Ba'avon arba'a dvarim hagshamim ne'etzarim. On account of 4 sins, the rain is stopped up or withheld. Ba'avon ovdei avodah zarah umegalei arayot v'shofchei damim uposkim b'rabim ve'inan notnim. It's the sin of idolatry and those who engage in illicit sexual relationships, and those who spill blood, and those who pledge in public but do not give. Now, what do you notice about this list? Does it sound familiar to you? Does part of it sound familiar?
Well, the top 3 are the standard 3.
Yes, the top 3 are the 3, if we can say this in Jewish context, the 3 cardinal sins, right? The big 3, right? Avodah zarah, gilui arayot, and shfichut damim, right? Those are the 3 things that you need to be killed rather than violate. Like, those are the 3 biggies. So if you're going to choose terrible sins on account of which God might stop the rain, this would be a kind of a natural list. And all of a sudden you tack one more thing on. So when you tack one more thing on to the big 3, that would suggest to me that what you're really doing is saying, yeah, we know about the big 3. Now here's what's really bad, right? And what's really terrible? What is it? People who don't write. So go home, guys, and write that check that you pledged to whoever you pledged. Exactly. You pledged charity, and you didn't pay up. On account of that, rain doesn't come. Now, if you turn to the next page, yeah, I know. I can see you, Jay, just calling up and saying,
God don't like us.
or anybody else, or Drisha for that matter. Is there another handout we can? Okay, thank you. Now, if you look at the top of the next page, this is the Talmud Bavli equivalent of that passage. And here, it's an interesting passage. We're not going to read through the whole thing, but if you sort of count the underlying things, you can see that there's 7 things with 1 underline, and 2 things with with a double underline. Do you see that? Where it says Babylonian Talmud, Ta'anit 7b, 8 to 8b? Yeah, okay. So this is actually, this is extracted from the course of a whole page and a half of Talmud. And over the course of that page and a half, several sages come along and say, rain is withheld because of such and such. Rain is withheld because of such and such. And actually there are 7 of those, which is just a kind of a nice literary number. And then twice they say, rain falls in such and such situation. So in any event, if you just want to kind of scan them, we're not going to read through all of them. I think what you'd notice is that most of the things here to which the stopping up of rain is attributed, actually, you don't have those big 3 at all. You don't have idolatry, you don't have murder, you don't have illicit sexual relationships. You have other kinds of misdeeds, many of which, not all of which, are kind of bin adam l'chavero, right? A kind of interpersonal misdeeds. And I want to point to 2 of them. One is the very last one. Rabbi Yochanan says, in hagshamim ne'atzorim ela, right, that rain is only stopped up on account of people who pledge charity in public and do not give. This is the same teaching we just saw in the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael. And then if you look at the third line, Rav Chisda says, well, rain is only stopped up on account of those who neglect Trumot and Masrot. Right? Trumot are the gifts to the priests, and Masrot are the gifts to the tithes that go to the Levites and to the poor. So these are two statements by rabbis that suggest that rain is stopped up when you don't give what you're supposed to give, when you don't give the tzedakah that you have committed yourself to giving, or when you don't give the agricultural gifts that the Torah requires you to give. So this is interesting, right? Because both of these texts are kind of prioritizing in relation to rain, a kind of sin or failure to fulfill your obligation, very different, hold on one second, very different from what's emphasized in Deuteronomy chapter 11. This is not Avodah Zarah, it's not Avodah Zarah plus, right? This is, you failed to give the charity that you were supposed to give. Yeah, Frida.
I'm just curious, it says, all of them say rain only falls or rain only is withheld.
Yeah.
Why, do they all really think that it's only their reason and not the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think so. I think it's a kind of rhetorical advice, right? Right? Rain is never stopped unless it means, I really want to. That's my sense.
Yeah.
But that's interpretation. Yeah.
That helps. All the things that we said about the land of Israel, that one was a different society also. They might have gotten water and
So that's very, very interesting.
There might be different sins that might be involved.
Okay, so that's very interesting. First of all, some of these rabbis are Babylonian, some are from the land of Israel. Secondly, as you saw, the Talmud of the land of Israel says a very similar thing. And thirdly, interestingly, you're quite right, that the Bavli is well aware that Bavel, right, Iraq, is much more like Egypt or Eden. Actually, it's probably where Eden is imagined to be, right? If you think back at chapter 2 of Genesis, right, you have the rivers that come out of this upswelling from the earth, and one is the Prat, and one is the Chidek, the Tigris and the Euphrates, right? So Bavel has the Fertile Crescent. So the Bavli is well aware that Bavel is much more similar to Mitzrayim, and they do not see that as a very good thing. They see that as a very useful thing, right? It's very convenient. You have Palestinian sages, visiting Bavel and saying, wow, there's so many dates here. If I lived here, I could learn so much Torah. And then they're up all night with terrible stomach aches because they eat too many dates. But so you have passages. So they're well aware that they have a much easier time with the fertility of the ground than the land of Israel, which is interesting. On the other hand, to me, there's quite a consistency here between the Babylonian Talmud and the Talmud of Eretz Israel in terms of this. Neither of them, they're not identical, but both of them are moving from a kind of absolute highlighting of Avodah Zarah to either adding on the idea of not fulfilling your pledges, or really kind of neglecting Avodah Zarah completely and moving toward misappropriating what's not yours or not sharing what you ought to be sharing. So that's my take on it, but it's an important point. Okay, I want to move to the next passage here. The Masechet Ta'anit. Anybody here raise your hand if you've learned either Mishnah or Gemara of Ta'anit at all? So already, okay. So in the first chapter, it talks about what happens if over the course of the beginning of the year, when beginning of the rainy season, rain doesn't come, and at different points in time, there begin to be these series of fasts. And before the community fast, there's a point in time much earlier where yechidim, individuals, fast. And the question is, who are these yechidim? So actually, the Babylonian Talmud and the Talmud of Eretz Israel have different interpretations of who these individuals are. So this is the Talmud Yerushalmi here, and it says, who are the Yechidim? The Yechidim are the people who are appointed stewards of the community. Mitmanim parnasim al hatzibur. The stewards of the community. And the Gemara is kind of puzzled by this and says, Mikevan shehu mitmaneh parnas al hatzibur hu mitpalel v'na'aneh. Really, because somebody is appointed the steward of a community, he has the power to pray and be listened to, and his prayers are going to be responded to. Like, what makes, just because somebody is the head of the city council, does that make him so righteous? Ella, the text says, "Mikevan shehu mitmaneh parnas al hatzibur v'nimtza ne'eman kedai hu mitzlaya u'mitanaya." But rather, if he's a person who has been appointed a steward of the community and is found to be ne'eman, he's found to be trustworthy, he's found to be faithful to his task, then he is worthy of praying and being responded to. And then the Gemara tells a story. It says, Chad Barnash, a certain individual, Havamapik Masra Ketiknan, right, was set aside his tithes as they're supposed to be. And he properly separated and presumably gave off his tithes. Amar le Rabbi Mana, so Rabbi Mana said to him, Kum, get up and say, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayit. Get up and recite the following pasuk. We'll read what the pasuk is in a second, but let me just explain that what's happening is that Rabbi Mana is saying, we need somebody to pray for rain, and because you are a person who correctly set aside your tithes, you are the person who can say this prayer. And notice, once again, we have this idea of the tithes, right? Giving the gifts to the poor that you're supposed to give, right? That, as we saw at the end of the passage just above, Rabbi Yochanan says, right, rain is stopped for people, because of people who don't give the tzedakah that they're supposed to give, and Rav Chisda on the third line, right, rain is stopped on account of people who don't give the proper tithes. So here's a guy who did give the proper tithes. So Rabbi Yochanan says, you get up and you're the one who should pray. Now, what prayer is he referring to? He says, say the following words, and these words are going to be the substance of the man's prayer. So what are these words? Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayit. It's all here for you, right here, and as well on the top of the next page. So what is it? What is this passage that he's supposed to say? Yeah.
Doesn't it mean that you remove the paladin from your house? In other words, the things that were already dedicated to someone that you don't have those things, you could just send them more than come off?
Right. So the things specifically are the tithes, right? This is Deuteronomy 26 has first, it sort of has two recitations in it, right? The first recitation earlier in Deuteronomy 26 is what we call mikvah bikurim, right? The recitation that a person would say when that person would bring their first fruits to the temple. And that begins Arami Oved Avi, which we say and explicate at the Seder, right? And right after that, the Torah gives another recitation, which is the recitation that you are to say when you remove the tithes from your house. So you've set aside these tithes, and now you distribute them. So verse 12 says, right, when you have finished tithing all of your tithes, v'natati lalevi lager layatom v'la'almana v'achlu b'sharecha b'saveu. You should give it to the Levite, to the stranger, to the orphan, and to the widow, and they shall eat in your gates, and they shall be satisfied. Okay, so that's who you give the tithes to. And then verse 13, and then you declare, you make a declaration. This is called vidui maaser in a Rabbinic text. You make a confession, or you make a declaration about your act of tithing before God. And you say, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayit. I've removed the sacred portion from my house, and I have given it to the Levite, and to the stranger, and to the orphan, and to the widow. I've done exactly what you asked me to do. And then skipping to verse 15, this is the prayer part of it. Hashkifa mimon kadshecha min hashamayim. Look down from your holy habitation, from the heavens. Uvarech et amcha et Yisrael, ve'et ha'adama asher natata lanu, ka'asher nishbata lavotenu, eretz zavat chalav udvash. Look down from your holy habitation and bless your people Israel and the land which you gave us, as you swore to our forefathers, a land flowing with milk and honey. So looking back at the text that we read a minute ago, right, this person, Rabbi Mana turns to the person who has correctly given his tithes, and he says, get up and say, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayit. What he means is, say the prayer that a person according to the Torah, can say when that person has given their tithes. And the prayer again is in verse 15. Look down from your holy habitation and bless your people. One second, bless your people and the land which you gave us. Okay, so 2 points before I ask you to share your thoughts. 2 points. Number one, another text that we just saw in the Yerushalmi that emphasizes that the person who merits the rain coming down is the person who gives the tithes. Simply the flip side of why would rain ever not come? Because people haven't given their tithes, or people haven't given tzedakah. And secondly, that the text that the person is to say in prayer, right, is not Shemona Esrei, right? But look down from your heavenly abode, right, and bless your people and the land which you gave to us. And what I want to do after you speak is ask what that resonates with, right? This verse, Hashkifa mima'on kedshecha. Yes.
That's what I'm saying. Also, is public pledge. They're making this pledge in public that they're going to be giving these tithes to charity.
Mhm.
It's mentioned the Golden Palestinian Babylon's house.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why we've been giving them.
Yes, yes.
Now it's not the public. They make the public pledge. Now
Yes.
they have to do it.
Exactly, right. And then when they do it, they're able to say, Hashkifa mima'on kedshecha. Right. Okay, so what do you make of this Hashkifa mima'on kedshecha min hashamayim? What is that? Does that sound familiar? Look down from your heavenly, holy habitation, from heaven. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
Very unusual. God's looked out at plain of Sodom.
Yes, and what does God do on stone? To stone?
He destroys them all. Fire or something.
Yeah, what's the verb? Well,
when it rains down.
yes, exactly, right? God is mamtir on stone. So that's very interesting, right? Because what's interesting, if you go back to that first source that we looked at in Genesis chapter 2, right? We saw that the source on the one hand says, well, God hasn't brought rain yet. Lohim tir, God hasn't rained down yet. Chapter 2, verse 5 on the first page. And on the other hand, so then you expect that it's going to say, now God brought rain, so there could be plant life, but instead it says that an aid came up from the ground. Again, that's what Bereshit Rabbah is trying to deal with. What? Rain? Aid? How'd that change? How come in Eden there was this aid, and later there was this rain? Now, Kasuto, famous Bible scholar, Kasuto has a very interesting interpretation here, which I think is absolutely correct. What Kasuto says is that chapter 2, verse 5, again, looking at the first page, chapter 2, verse 5 is anticipating something that's going to be happening later on. Like this is describing verse 6, verse 7, verse 8, verse 9, are describing the world of Eden, the world that we had in Gan Eden. But verse 5, which introduces those verses, is actually anticipating the world as it's going to be outside of Eden. Mm-hmm. And what Kasuto says is that the world of Eden, and now I'll kind of use my formulation, not his, the world of Eden, as Suri said before about Egypt, sounds like a pretty good place to live, right? After all, the water's just there. You know, Adam and Eve, they sort of walk through the garden and they can pluck fruit anytime they want. They don't have to work very hard. It's all they need to do is listen to one little command, which they fail to do. But it's really not so bad because the water's always there. But the world after Eden is a different kind of a place. The world after Eden is the world that people enter into at the moment then they are knowers of good and evil, which means at the moment that they become human beings who can make autonomous choices. And rain here, the rain anticipated, the matar anticipated in verse 5, is the way God will respond to those choices in the post-Edenic world. In other words, the contrast here between verses 5 and 6 is kind of very similar, right, to the contrast that we saw in Deuteronomy 11 between Israel and the land of Egypt, right? Matar will be rain, right? Being susceptible to having or not having rain will be the situation into which you are thrust when you become a human being who is enjoined to make choices. Now, getting back to Ezra's point, what's very interesting about that is that what is the very first time the word matar, or the verse lahamtir, is used in a narrative in the Chumash? Mhm. You should know. It's the last time I saw you was. When's the last time we saw each other? Thanksgiving weekend? Movie?
Ah, yes. Noah.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it wasn't Parsha Noah, but it was the Noah movie. That's right. It's in the story of Noah, right? God is Mamtir, the flood. Okay, the second one is what Ezra said. God is Mamtir. What?
Too much water.
Too much water.
Flood.
That's right. The flood
Oh, God.
is matar of judgment. It destroys. Right? The second time is stone, which is matar of judgment. It destroys. And the third time is, what's the third time we have a story where God is mamtir or something?
The hail?
Yeah, right. The plague of hail, where God is mamtir, something that destroys. So what's very interesting is that the matar, ki lo himtir Hashem Elokim, right? Kusulo's point is that rain, right, and whether it's rain or something that's rained down, right, it could be hailstones, right, but something that's rained down from the heavens is an instrument of judgment. And in fact, in the narratives of the Chumash, it's almost always, and certainly the first three times it happens, it's an instrument of negative judgment, right? It's not life-giving, but it's life-destroying. The fourth time is, in fact, life-giving, and the fourth time is the fourth narrative in the Chumash where there's God rains something down. It's the man, right? It's the man. There's also an element of judgment in that story as well, by the way. But that's a separate thing. So it is interesting that what Ezra is pointing to is that hashkifa mim'om kadshecha in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 15, hashkifa might have within it an element of judgment. It could be negative judgment, as in the story of stone, or here it could be positive. Look down, God, and notice I've done exactly what you asked me to do. I've given my tithes to the poor and to the widow and to the orphan and to the stranger. Look down and notice that and bless. Okay, so there's an element of judgment is what Ezra's picking up on. What else? Where else do we see looking down? Yeah?
Can I say something else?
Sure.
Because Pharaoh, someone who used to live down in the surrounding culture, a lot of times the person in charge is deciding about who gets the water, but it's the irrigation. So some of this is like if a person in the system where they have irrigation, if a person is selfish and they're not keeping the rules, they might change the irrigation.
We'll get to that. That's very important. Hold on to that. What's your name? Ruth? Okay, hold on to that because we're going to see a reference to exactly that in a second. Okay. Where else have we seen in the text we've read tonight looking down?
Looking down from above.
Look down from your holy habitation, from heaven. But where else have we seen it? Tonight. The elf on the shelf. So you got so distracted with the elf on the shelf, you forgot about looking down. Deuteronomy 11 on the second page, right? Deuteronomy 11, verse 12. It's a land which God is doresh. Always the eyes of the Lord your God are upon it. God is always looking down. So here again, you have the notion that rain, right, signifies God looking down and looking down in positive judgment, right, that you have done what you're supposed to do, and therefore that God will give you more of that blessing which you have shared, right? That's why Rabbi Mana says to this gentleman who has separated his tithes, you can say, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayit, and we know that God will listen to your prayer because Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayit continues, Hashkif mimon kachecha, look down, notice what we've done, and bless your people and your land, right? Rain down your blessings so that we can continue to give the tithes and share your blessing. Okay, so let's pause all this for a minute. And I want to go back to the source that we started with. The source that we started with made an observation. And the observation was that originally, back at the time of the creation, back in Eden, the earth drank from this aid, right, from the subterranean upswelling of water, and God changed God's mind. So that's a really not good idea. And I'm going to do things differently from now on, and I'm going to make sure that the land drinks from above. Again, referencing verses 5 and 6 of Genesis 2. And now the first source, Drisha Rabbah, offers 4 explanations for why God changed God's mind. Okay, Rav Chanai de Tziporin, B'Shem Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, if I know where we are, right back to the first source, said, Mipnei arba'a dvarim chazar bo HaKadosh Baruch Hu shelo tehei haaretz shota el milmala. On account of 4 things, God changed God's mind, deciding that the earth from now on would only drink from above. And here are the 4 things. Number 1, Mipnei ba'alei zroa. Ruth, that's your point. Actually, we'll get to that. Number 2, bishvil hadiach tlalim ra'im. Number 3, shehiyeh hagavoa shotek kenamuch. And number 4, sheyehu hakol tolim einehem klape mala. Hadahu dechtiv lasum shvalim lamarom. Okay, so number 1 is on account of strong men. It's strong, think of Popeye, like Baalei Zroa, right? On account of strong men, Drisha Rabbah, right? On account of strong men. Number 2, in order to cleanse bad dews. Number 3, in order that the high might drink like the low. And number 4, so that everybody would direct their eyes upward. As it says, quoting the book of Job, Lasum shvalim lamarom, which they're understanding here as so that those below might look upward. There might be another interpretation of that as well. And the next verse, which is not quoted here, is Hanoten matar al pnei aretz v'sholech maim al pnei chutzot, right? That God gives matar, God gives rain on the surface of the earth, and sends forth water on the fields. Okay, so let's think about these 4 reasons. Okay, I actually don't want to talk right now about the second one, bishvil hadiach tlalim ra'im, which is nice, I think, especially in our contemporary world. I think it's the idea that through this water cycle, right, it actually purifies the water, and you get pure water as opposed to rancid water. But I want to leave that one aside and focus on the other 3. What does it mean, mipnei baalei zroa? Ruth, tell us what that means.
I didn't know that that's what they would have meant, but
Okay.
sometimes I guess it's a type of, using your strength of your reach.
Yeah.
You can reach something that's not really yours, and you use the strength to divert what could have gone otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, when rain comes through rivers or streams or channels on the earth, somebody who lives upstream can simply, and that person will often be wealthier and more powerful, right, can simply divert that water to their field and make sure that the people who live downstream don't get much. We have this, by the way, this is
American West all the time.
How about in the land of Israel all the time, right? What's happening to the waters of the Jordan River, right? Where is it actually going to, right? And who has rights to that? So this is a huge issue, right? When water flows on the earth, some people who are more powerful or more privileged can take more of that water for themselves. But you actually can't do that so easily with the rain. If it falls on my field, you can actually get it from me. So that's the first thing. The third thing, v'shehiyeh hagavoha shotek kenamuch. What's that talking about? That the high might drink like the low. What does high and low mean here? Probably.
Well, the hills get as much as the valley.
Yeah, probably, right? As we said before, in a land that's watered through irrigation, right? Those who live lower down will get more of that water, and those who live high up will not get it. But if it's getting it from the rain can fall all over. Yeah.
But it's not only literal; it's also
okay.
It's sort of like solar energy compared to, there's certain things that are coming from heaven, and when you have to depend on Pharaoh to give you your share of something, and you wouldn't, but just enough for it to work for him was one thing. But then when we were relying on the rain from heaven, everybody can have something fall in their field and go.
Right. Right, so whether Nemuch necessarily means hills and valleys, or whether it means other kinds of situatedness, it could mean both. I just want to point out that if you flip the page for a second back to Deuteronomy 11, you'll notice that in verse 11, remember it said, a land of hills and valleys. Right? So what's interesting to me here, right, here you have in Deuteronomy a land of hills and valleys. Here you have that the high can drink like the low. And I think what it's sort of, to my mind, taking that geographical observation, right, it's really useful in a land of hills and valleys to have rain as opposed to just a river. And here it's making it into a kind of a moral issue, right? Because the land of Israel is a land of hills and valleys, God decided, or because the world in general has hills and valleys, or people better situated and worse situated, God decided that God better bring it from above so that God can make sure to share that thing equally, right? So it becomes not just kind of pragmatic, but a deeply moral issue. And then the last one is V'sheyehu hakol tolim einehem klape mala, so that everybody literally hangs their eyes, right? Directs their eyes upward. Now that's kind of interesting to me, right? So that everybody directs their eyes upward, because if we see this text as being in conversation with the Deuteronomy 11 text, right, which is the text that really kind of tries to spell out what's different about rain versus getting your water from the earth, the Deuteronomy 11 text talked about God's eyes, right? That rain signifies that God is always looking down, and this text is kind of doing the converse of that. Right? That rain is something which causes us to put our eyes above. And I think what's interesting about that is that when you have this text in conversation with the Deuteronomy 11 text, you kind of have a reciprocal looking, right? That what happens with rain, and it's kind of, you know, when you think about rain, one interesting thing about it, whatever your theology is, that I certainly feel this way with snow, because you can kind of hold it in your hand, you know, that you're holding something, right, which came from the heavens. You know, I mean, rain is actually something that bridges the heavens and the earth. Now, the hakol tolim here can mean, especially in when you say tolim, right, something hanging on, right? On the one hand, it signifies dependency, right? Everybody is looking upwards, so in dependency, right? You, as somebody said before, in looking at the Deuteronomy text, right? If rain comes from above, you realize that you're dependent on that coming down. You're dependent on God. But in addition, it's almost like a revelation, right? That rain is a revelatory thing. When you see, when you anticipate rain coming down, you look upward, and at the same time, God's kind of looking downward at you. It's this kind of reciprocal gaze, right? God's looking down at you, and you are looking up at God. And where I think that takes us is kind of to a next step, which also kind of brings us back to the Deuteronomy 26 source about the declaration when you bring your tithes, which is that I think one of the things that's going on here is this notion that God's looking down at us to see how are we doing. And the how are we doing, according to rabbinic text, really means how are we doing in distributing the blessings that we have. But at the same time, we're looking upward. Now, looking upward, again, is dependency. It's noticing God's, gift to us. But looking up is also, I think, in this text, doing something else. Because we've already said that the whole point of rain here, right, is that God wants to make sure to rain down the water, right, in a way that nobody who's more powerful or more of a bully can take control over. That God wants to rain down the water in a way that whether you're situated high or you're situated low, right? Whatever your status is, whatever your privilege is, whatever your geographical location is, that you have equal access. So when we look at rain, right, when we put our eyes heavenward, meaning we're saying, well, what can I understand when I look at the blessing of rain? What I can understand is that God chooses to give that blessing in a way that everybody has equal access. And therefore, what I do when I give out my tithes is simply do with the rain exactly what God's intention for the rain is, right? The produce that grows from the rain simply needs to be distributed or shared in such a way that manifests God's intention for the rain. And when that happens, the rain comes down, right? It's almost an immediate, it's not even a kind of reward for, it's almost this kind of reciprocity again of, God sending down something that's meant to be shared and us sharing it, meaning that it comes down because that's what it's supposed to be for. Give me a second. Is that okay? All right, I want to move on just to the last passage that we're going to do, and then we can open it for comments and questions for those who have any. On the very last page, this is actually a very famous passage. It wasn't famous until about 5 years ago, and then I've seen it all over the place. But there's a good reason for that. It's a great passage. This is from Bavli Ta'anit. There are two little stories. Don't read them yet. I want to say a word about them. In the third chapter of Ta'anit, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of stories about rain. That's where the Choni stories are, for example. Toward the end of the chapter, there's a long series of short stories about different sages who prayed for rain or declared a fast when there was no rain. And in each and every one of those stories, the rabbi fails to bring rain through his prayers or fasting, which is extremely striking, not only because they're rabbis and great ones at that, but because, again, this is the third chapter of Masechet Ta'anit. The first two chapters are all about the prayers and the fasts that you're supposed to do when there's no rain. And then all of a sudden, chapter 3, you have all these stories in the Gemara of people, and rabbis no less, who do exactly those prayers and fasts, and it never works, not once. Not once does it work. It works after something else happens, but it never immediately works. They pray, they fast, and rain doesn't come. And in the middle of that series of stories come these two stories. So I'll read the two stories together and then make a couple of comments about it. Rebbe Gazar Ta'anita V'lo Ata Mitra. Rebbe, right? That's Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, right? The head rabbi of his time, compiler of the Mishnah, decreed a fast, but rain didn't come. Ilfa, and some say it was Rabbi Ilfi, went down before him. Went down is the term that the Talmud uses to lead the prayers. Right? In those days, they didn't go up high on the bima. They actually went down to pray. Mimam Akim. Anybody here go to the leader minyan? The leader minyan? Okay, so the leader minyan's official name, leader minyan is a great minyan in Jerusalem, its official name is Amika Debira, right, the depth of the pit. Right? Oh. So the idea is that you pray from a low place, you don't pray from a high place. Tell that to your local chazan. But in any event, so Ilfa, or some say Rabbi Ilfi, went down before him to pray. Amar, this man said, Mashiv HaRuach, he who causes the wind to blow, B'nasazika, the wind started to blow. He said, Mori Hagashem, he who causes the rain to fall, and rain came. Amarle, so Rebbe said to him, Mayuvdach, what do you do? Amarle, this person said to Rebbe, Dayana b'kusta dechika, deleit bechamra lekidusha v'avdalta, tarachna v'atina chamra lekidusha v'avdalta, umafikna lehu yidei chovatayhu. He said, I live in a small village that's very poor, and people there don't have wine for Kiddush and Havdalah. So I work hard to bring them wine for Kiddush and Havdalah so that I enable them to fulfill their obligation. And then the next story, Rav, and Rav is kind of the greatest sage of his generation, Rav Iklalahu Atra, he went to a certain place, Gazar Ta'anita V'lo Ata Mitra, he declared a fast, but rain didn't come. Nochit Kamei Shlicha de Tzibur, so a certain person went down to lead the prayers before him. Amar Mashiv HaRuach, B'nashav Zika, Amar Mored Hagashem, V'ata Mitra. So the guy said the words Mashiv HaRuach, he who causes the wind to blow, and the wind started to blow. He said Mored Hagashem, he who causes the rain to fall, and the rain started to fall. Amarle, Mayuvdach. So Rav says to him, what do you do? Amarle, Mikre Dardike Ana, Umakrina Livnei Aniye Kivnei Atire, V'chol Delo Efshar Le Lo Shaklina Minei Midi. V'idli pera de chavri, v'chol man de pasha mishachtina le minayhu, musadrina le, mufaisina le, ad ati v'kari. So he said to him, I am a teacher of young children. I teach children to read. And I teach the children of the poor like the children of the rich. And anybody who can't afford it, I don't take any fees from him. And I have a little fish pond, maybe an aquarium in the kindergarten, a little fish pond. And whoever misbehaves, I bribe him with them. And I work things out and I appease him until he comes and reads. Maybe he gives him a job to feed the fish or something like that. He engages him in that. So there's, to me, a few striking things. I mean, they're great stories, plain and simple, but a few striking things about these stories. One is that these guys are actually not saying the prayers to request rain. What is the prayer for rain? We want rain. Where do we say that? Well, speak up.
The same time.
Right, we say that later on in the Shemona Esrei, right? We say that in Birkat Hashanim, B'tein tal u'matar livracha. Please give us rain. Right? That's called She'ilat Geshamim, asking for rain. In the second chapter of Tani, the chapter just before this, there's a whole ritual for fast days for rain, where in addition you add 6 brachot to the middle of the Amidah, where you ask for rain, you ask for God's help. These guys never get to the middle bracha, because as soon as they're in the second bracha, right? Now we know about the second bracha. The first 3 brachot are not bakashot, they're not requests, right? The first 3 brachot of the Amidah are not requests at all. They're talking about God's attributes. The second bracha is talking about God's attributes. And when we say that second bracha, we say, Atagi bar l'olam Hashem, mechayim eiti matarav lo'oshia, mashiv haruch, mer hagashem, mechakel b'chayim b'chesed, etc. Right? We're listing God's attributes. And as these people are listing God's attributes, they say, okay, God, you're very great. You bring wind. Wind starts to blow. You bring rain. Rain starts to fall. And they haven't even gotten to ask for it yet. So I want to highlight that, right? Everybody else is fasting and not only, saying V'tein Talmud HaRacha, but saying all these extra prayers and blowing the shofar, this whole ritual. And these guys never get to ask. They don't get to ask. So we'll get back to that in a minute. Well, what is it that these guys are doing? What is it that they're doing? What's so great about what they're doing? Yeah.
Well, they're not just writing checks. They're putting themselves on the line. They're making personal effort. I think that's part of it. I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff too.
Okay, they're making personal effort, and also, by the way, at an expense to them. Right? One's bringing wine and tarachna. It's not easy for him, whether it's financially not easy or whether he has to travel far, we don't know. And the other guy is not just giving up on the tuition, right? But he's putting himself out there to make sure that every child, no matter how difficult, gets to learn how to read. Yeah.
It's like the rain when it's first it reaches all people. He's saying that I reach all people. It doesn't have the rich or poor or whatever. I'm just distributing the resources.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I think that's exactly right. I think what these two people do, I mean, these are kind of very not spectacular acts, right? These are acts, by the way, that people around us do all the time, right? There are many teachers that we know who do this all the time.
Anybody can do those things.
Anybody can do these things. That's right. These people are not necessarily wealthy. They're not necessarily brilliant. They're not necessarily learned. We don't even know how many other mitzvahs they do. Hold on a second. Right? What we know is, right, that they, for whatever reason, are in a position where with effort, quite a lot of effort, they can do exactly what you're saying that they do. Right? They make sure that everybody has equal access to what it is that they can offer. It's not enough that I have it, and it's not enough that the privilege has, but everybody has it. And what I think is interesting about that is what I said a minute ago, that God responds to them not when they ask, right? They actually don't get to ask. God responds to them when God simply hears the words, right? Hears the words. You're the one who brings the wind. You're the one who causes the rain to fall. And it's like God said, oh yeah, that's what I do. And to me, that's really the message that we saw with this hashkifa mima'on kadshecha min hashamayim uvarech et amcha, right? Look down from the heavens and bless. The idea is that basically what the rain is telling us, right, is that the rain means that the way it's supposed to be and what we have the power to do is to make sure that everybody has a share of the blessing. And when we do that, the blessing naturally comes. In other words, it is God's way. What this text, I think, is telling us, it is, in fact, God's way to be Mashiach Ruach HaMoed HaGashem. That is the way it is. Sometimes things get in the way. Sometimes that flow of blessing gets stopped up. And it gets stopped up when something interrupts that flow. What interrupts the flow is when it doesn't flow the way it's supposed to, and we're the people actually who interrupt that flow. Right? When we keep that flow from flowing the way the rain is supposed to flow, which is to everybody, that interrupts that flow. That's what Vatsar Tashman, that's what closes it up. When we give those tithes, and give that tzedakah, and do something much more difficult than tithing and tzedakah, which is make sure that every child can read and everybody has the wine that they need for Kiddush and Havdalah. When we do those things, then God barely needs to be reminded, and it's, oh yes, that's right, yeah, here it is, right? That's the way it needs to be. And again, there's, I think, that reciprocity, right? When we look up to the rain and see what the rain is asking us to do, God at the same time is looking down at us and saying, yes, that's right. That is what the rain is for, and here it is. And I think that's really kind of what's being offered here in terms of rain, that these texts are offering us really one of the most mundane things in our world. Rain happens here all the time in Israel, part of the year, but it's one of the most mundane experiences. And the text is offering us a vision of that transforms that rain into something that is always potentially with us, and that asks us to kind of think all the time about how we act in the world. So let me just kind of sum up with a couple of sentences, and then for people who want to stay, some time for questions. So what I think these texts show is that, first of all, that rain is a form of revelation. It's something that's coming down from the heavens, and it's something that calls upon us to look up to the heavens. That rain is a kind of encounter with God. It's a bridging of the upper and the lower worlds. That rain signifies God's presence, right? The land of Israel is a land that has rain, meaning God is there. God is noticing. God is with us in care and in demand. God's presence makes demands. God's presence also offers blessing, and God's presence enacts judgment. Okay? What is it that you're doing? What is it that you need to be doing? The blessing of rain, according to these texts, is something that we cannot control. It is something of which we can't take a greater share than what anybody else has. And it's something in which God's desire to sustain everyone and all creatures is manifest. And therefore, the blessing of rain reminds us of our responsibility to create and sustain a world in which everybody has a share in those blessings. So, as I said at the beginning of this session, I didn't say anything you don't know. What I'm offering is really an image, kind of an imaginative framework of when we see rain or we think about rain, being reminded that rain entails us looking up and God looking down, and what does that demand of us, and what model does it offer us in terms of how we act in the world. And as I said before, really the core of this series is the next two sessions, because the next two sessions are going to teach us how to do that. First, next week, really offering us a picture of what it is that's working out there and what it is that's not working out there. And then the third week, really offering us models for how we can engage in the work which we're being asked to do. So again, please, if you're able to come back, come back. And whether or not you're able to come back, please do take at least one of those flyers and put it someplace where somebody else can see it. If you got the emails from us and you'll be getting another email from us, send it on. Put it on your Facebook page. We think this is hugely important. And I suspect that almost everybody in this room has in some way engaged with the work of hunger. I want a lot of people in this room who haven't engaged with work as hunger, as well as you all, because you all and I have much to learn. So thank you so much for coming. I'm here if people have questions or comments, but I also want to let people leave if people want to leave. So if you want to leave, just leave kind of a little quietly, and people want to stay, I'm here. So go ahead.
This is just a comment. This is a fabulous introduction to the series. You did it again. There's an old it's sort of a joke about some community in the Midwest, America, Christians. It's not raining, so pastor said, okay, we gotta pray for rain. So everybody comes to church. So he looks around, he says, oh, this isn't gonna work. Said, what do you mean? You didn't even try yet. You didn't say anything yet. He says, nobody brought an umbrella.
That's great.
Yeah, I wish I'd make that up.
That's great. That sounds like some of the stories in Tani.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Some of them say, you're not desperate enough. You're praying, you're going through the motions, but you don't. Yeah.
Sure, I heard this story.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the ratios, it's almost if both man and rain are coming from the earth. And it's if God hasn't yet decided to me which creation is more important of his. The water, the rain is important, and because in that passage, it's actually making it as if the function of human beings is to take care of the earth.
That's right.
So I was thinking about the Nile. Look, they made the Aswan Dam, and they changed the whole Nile. I mean, what human beings do, that's I'm just I'm thinking about climate change. I'm thinking about global warming. I mean, how did we become so arrogant in a sense? 'Cause in that,
Right.
From voracious to
Right.
now.
Well, you're making an important point because, I've sort of characterized the creation of the human being in chapter 2 as, there's a job description and nobody to fulfill it, right? What's quite clear as the passage progresses, we don't have here, is, God puts the human being in the garden of Da'ul Shama to work it and to guard it. Right? In other words, the human being is essential here because there can't be a world without the human being. Very different, from chapter 1 where it sort of culminates, in the human being. But the story of, from the time the human being reaches out and takes that one thing, just one thing that he's not supposed to have or she's not supposed to have, straight through Migdal Pavel and, every other story in the Tanakh and in human history, is a long story of people reaching beyond maybe what they should be reaching for or reaching for it without regard to, the consequences of that. And to me, that goes back to that first Breshit Lava text, right? It's interesting, by the way, there's a midrash that I think it's about Migdal Bavel, that the tower builders took with them picks, right? Picks to attack the heavens so that they could make the rain fall. They thought they could reach up and make the rain, they could control it. And there's another midrash that the descendants of Cain, right, said, hey, God, who needs your rain, right? In other words, the notion is that rain, at the end of the day, there's a midrash that comes up also in the Talmud that says that there are 3 keys that God doesn't hand over to anybody else. Right? The key of childbirth, the key of resurrection of the dead, and the key of rain. And there's a notion that there's some things that we control so many things. There's got to be something that shows us the limits of human control. And that reminds us that there are limits to that. Now, of course, we live in a world where we try to control reproduction. I'm not saying that's all bad. I'm just saying, where we start to, encroach, upon kind of even those things. I don't know if we do resurrection yet, but maybe with cloning, right? And then there's rain. Now, maybe we try to control that too, seeding the cloud. Right? But there is a notion that the core sources of life, rain and childbirth and resurrection, those core sources of life are things that, that represent a kind of a boundary of human capacity. Because when those things are handed over to humans, you have the Baalei Zroa, who take it, who take what they want without regard to the consequences for others. So I think these texts do raise hugely important points about not just the environment, but really about the place of the human being in the world and what the boundary is. Which is why I think within this chapter of Tani, it never really works to pray for rain, because if it just worked to pray for rain, then what that means is that you do control it. So you do have to pray for it. You do have to pray for it. But if you pray for it thinking that that's going to work, it never works, because then it's in your control after all. So I think, you know, those are really key themes here. And again, rain kind of reminds us of that. And especially if you sort of take this trajectory of Drisha Draba seriously, that, you know, it used to be in your control, and God said, not a good idea. I'm gonna take that over, because there needs to be something that's not in your hands. Yeah.
Yeah, the thing is, there's control in the sense of we're gonna do these rituals and we're gonna fast and we're gonna do all those, those 6 blocking, do all this stuff. That's one kind of control that isn't really always gonna work. You're not in control. But the stories, those 2 beautiful stories about the guy with the fish and the otherwise, that's doing something.
Exactly.
It's not the same.
And they're not doing it to get the rain.
That's
okay?
exactly
what they're doing is
they're
functioning on this earth.
right.
They're not trying to control the
They're
heavens.
not doing it.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Right.
Very good.
Okay, you know what, I'm gonna say goodnight to everybody, and I'll stay for people who still want to talk. But thank you so much for coming, and please bring your flyers. Thank you.